See if we're gonna have anybody show up tonight. Otherwise, I'm just gonna tell you about the history of voting rights in America and voter suppression and the SAVE Act we're gonna talk about. There's a lot of scary stuff going around about the SAVE Act. So we're gonna talk about all these things. All right. So, history of voter suppression in the United States. I don't know how much history people know. I was a history major in college and a political science minor, and then I read nonfiction history books for fun. So I guess I'm just a giant nerd. So that's like what I love. So I can tell you about history. Um, Back when our country first started, only land owning individuals were allowed to vote. That they did not actually say that it had to only be white males, but in effect, it was usually only white males that owned property, though there were a few black males that owned property and could vote at the time, and even a few widows who owned property, they inherited it, and they could vote at some point. Um, let's see. Then people started fighting for their rights to vote, right? Everybody, people didn't want to have to vote only because or be allowed to vote only because you own property. So then they started expanding the vote, and then they took away the property requirement but left it where only white males could vote. And it was that way for a long time. So when we talk about, in the early 19th century, so the 1800s, only about half of our nation's inhabitants could vote. So there was a whole group. Most people couldn't vote. Only white men could vote, except for there was actually a law in New Jersey that allowed women to vote. And this I found really interesting because it really echoes what we're seeing right now. In 1807, accusations of dun 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 voter fraud pushed New Jersey's government to pass a law that limited voting to only white men. What are we seeing right now? Accusations of voting fraud. And what are we seeing? A push for the SAVE Act. So we're going to talk about that in a bit. Let's see. So for a long time, they didn't actually put in the law that you had to be a white male to vote. But like I said, in effect, the only property owners were usually white males, so they could vote, but nobody else. And then when the state started lifting the property ownership requirements is when they started putting in laws that said only white males could vote. And so then actually black males who had been able to vote before and widows who had been able to vote before, their right to vote was taken away. Native Americans were prohibited from voting, and they were treated as members of a foreign nation, at least until 1887 when something called the Dawes Act was passed. And that act actually broke up reservations and distributed land to individuals. And it did create a pathway to citizenship for Native Americans, but there was a requirement that those Native Americans had to assimilate fully into the new, I guess, the society that the Europeans wanted them to assimilate into. Then in 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act was passed, and that paved the way for Native Americans to vote without having to renounce their native citizenship. But many states did continue to obstruct Native American voting well into the 20th century. So we know that originally there weren't necessarily gender requirements, but it was in effect that women couldn't vote because only men owned property. Some, like I said earlier, some widows were allowed to vote because they would have inherited property from their spouses after they passed away. And then we talked about New Jersey, how after the revolution, only New Jersey allowed women to vote, and then until 1807, and the accusations of voter fraud, they took that right away um, until 1890, when Wyoming became a state. Wyoming actually allowed women to vote, so they were the first. But then we didn't have full voting rights for women until the passage of the 19th Amendment, which was in 1920. And I'm sure most people have heard about, Susan B. Anthony and women's suffrage rights. Um, but let's talk about African Americans' abilities to vote. So in 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed, and that abolished slavery. Then in 1868, the 14th Amendment gave African Americans equal protection under the law. And then in 1870 is when the 15th Amendment was passed, and it prohibited um, disenfranchising voters based on race or skin color or previous condition of servitude. So it should have allowed African Americans to vote, but we're going to talk about how very they used laws to keep that from happening too. And I found it interesting today that Tennessee actually didn't ratify the 15th Amendment until 1997, I learned. And today, only two states, Maine and Vermont, actually give everyone an uninhibited right to vote. So any citizens are allowed to vote there. A lot of other states have restrictions based on, if someone's been convicted of a felony, there will be some conditions there. So after the Civil War and the passing of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, we saw a rise in what's called Jim Crow laws in the southern states. And I don't know if they teach this in school still or not. Hopefully they do, because it's really important to remember. But one such law was a poll tax. And that would, of course, disproportionately affect black voters because they did not have the funds that white people did. There were still states with poll taxes all the way up until 1964. They also would use literacy tests to disenfranchise voters. If you could not read or write, then you might not be allowed to vote. The tests were actually only administered at the discretion of the people in charge of voter registration. So they could pick and choose who they were going to administer these tests to. And you guessed it, very frequently it was used to prevent African Americans from voting. They would also ask civics questions as part of the test. One of the questions that I found as an example, and I'll post all my links in the comments when I'm done. In which document or writing is the Bill of Rights found? Or name two purposes of the U.S. Constitution. So those were ways that they got around actually allowing African Americans to fully have the right to vote. And now you have to remember these literacy tests, right? Who are the African Americans that are voting back in this time? They're the descendants of slaves who were not allowed to learn how to read and write. There were laws against, in many states, them learning how to read and write. So it was making it impossible for them to vote. And that was the whole idea behind it. And here's another super interesting thing, because if you were a black person and you couldn't pass the literacy test, then you couldn't vote. But there were white men that also couldn't pass it. So what did they do? They had what was called, you might have learned about this in school, the grandfather clause, which said if your grandfather voted in 1867, then you could still vote even if you couldn't pass the test. In 1915, the grandfather clause was ruled unconstitutional. In 1964, poll taxes were abolished by the 24th Amendment. And the Voting Rights Act of 1865 outlawed literacy tests. Then we know the 19th Amendment in 1920 was passed to give women the right to vote, but actually still black women were denied the right to vote using these constitutional tests that they had. Today, what does voting look like? Today we have what's called gerrymandering, which probably a lot of people have heard of. And basically what that is they redraw districts in a way that gives one party a political advantage over the other. And we see that a lot. That happens a lot. There are laws about it. I see court cases about it sometimes. Um, but what it does is it serves to dilute individuals' votes. It will, if you collect all, let's say you collect all Democrats in one little area, right? And then they can vote on one representative, and then the whole rest of the state has, I don't know, 3 Republicans, right? And they're all Republican voters. And then you get 3 Republican representatives and 1 Democratic representative. Or or I've also seen it where, let's say you have a predominantly Democratic, and I'm just saying Democratic. It can be used the other way too. We'll change it so that we don't upset people. You have a predominantly Republican um, area, right? And the Democrats don't want the Republicans to win anymore. So what do? They're going to cut it in half and send these Republicans over here with the other Democrat with the more Democratic area, and then these over here with the other more Democratic area, and they're going to dilute their votes so that they don't win the office. So those are ways that gerrymandering works. Now, let's talk about the SAVE Act, how we got where we are today. So in 1993, they passed the Voting Rights Act, or the National Voter Registration Act of 1993. This was actually meant to make it easier for people to register to vote. So when you would go to the DMV, also public assistance facilities and disabilities agencies, you would be able to register to vote. We all know, probably, you've gone to the DMV to register to vote. They ask you if you want to vote. Yeah, you want to register to vote. And then in 2013, the Supreme Court actually ruled part of that act unconstitutional in a case called Shelby County versus Holder. And that ruling opened the door for what we're starting to see more and more of, the voting ID laws, the polling places that have been closed, cutbacks to early voting. I know for Kansas, our state legislature just voted to remove the 3-day grace period for mail-in voting. And I will tell you, when I first moved to Kansas in 2011, we moved to Prairie Village, and I thought it was amazing that I could just request a ballot to vote, to mail-in ballot. It made it so simple, so easy to vote. And it wasn't a controversy, actually, until let's see, I guess 2020, when it was against Biden, and everyone was so upset about it. And I was kind of shocked because this was something that I had been doing and thought this was amazing that everybody should do it. But so that's when it kind of became a controversy. And so now they've voted to remove the 3-day grace period, which would have given you, so let's say you mail in your ballot, right? But the post office takes a long time to get it there. As long as it's there within those 3 days following the election day, then you're still good. So the legislature voted for it. We have what they call a supermajority in Kansas. It's very Republican controlled in our state legislature. The governor actually vetoed the bill, but the veto was overridden by the legislature. So the SAVE Act is just edits basically to the original Voter Registration Act. It makes it harder to register to vote. You will have to prove your citizenship. I think I talked about this a little bit last week. My understanding at least is that if your birth certificate does not have your current name on it, so let's say you get married. I got married and I took my husband's last name. My birth certificate does not have my current last name on it. So that's not good enough proof now for my citizenship for me to be able to vote. I would need something else, like a passport. Passports, last time I checked, were about $160. So while we can't have poll taxes anymore, in effect, we're going to be charging people at least $160 to prove that they're citizens to be able to vote. Now, you say, yeah, we only want citizens to vote. Yeah, agree. Completely agree with you. Only citizens should vote. So let's talk about that. Well, number one, non-citizen voting is extremely rare. Anyone telling you otherwise is lying to you. Um, Non-citizens who can go and get a driver's license, and some of them can't. In some states, if you're undocumented, you can get a driver's license, but in many of them you can't. And actually, I know in Kansas and Missouri, your driver's license will say whether you're a citizen or not. Now, there was a problem at one point, especially this I read about today. I had heard about it, but I read about it in Pennsylvania. They had you would go to the DMV, and the DMV people would be like, "Hey, you want to vote?" And maybe the person didn't understand what was happening, or they just said yes, or maybe the DMV person didn't understand that they couldn't vote, or whatever would happen. But accidentally, they would be registered to vote, right? Well, there are really strict laws that prevent non-citizens from voting. If a non-citizen votes, and let me just say this really quick, none of this is legal advice. I am an attorney, but I'm not here as an attorney. I'm just here to chat with people and educate. So don't take this as legal advice. If you need an attorney, please reach out to one. Um, but so they would end up on the voter rolls, but most of the time they wouldn't vote. Every once in a while, you'd see somebody. There's been reports of a non-citizen actually participating in voting. If you end up on the roll, my understanding, at least as far as I can recall, is that you need to get off of it. You need to remove your registration. But if you actually vote, you are not allowed to become a citizen in the United States. So non-citizens are not trying to do anything that makes it where they cannot then naturalize if they want to. So it's just lies. Again, it's just lies. They just like to lie. Um, and they did this actually. So in 2014, there was a guy named Jesse Richmond who took actually a 2008 online survey. And that survey had claimed that 6.4% of non-citizens registered to vote. But then the developers of the survey came out with their own response to Richmond's paper that said, no, this is not right. These calculations were not right. The survey was not done well. It's ripe for for inaccuracy. So then in 2016, Richmond's estimates were used to fuel the false claims that millions of non-citizens were voting. 200, after that happened, 200 political scientists wrote an open letter and rejected the 2014 paper. But still, a website called Just Facts, whatever that is, published a report that claimed that between 10 to 27% of non-citizens are illegally registered to vote. That took off on X and was actually used in congressional testimony. Richmond, the guy that wrote the paper, has since revised his estimates to say that just under 1% of non-citizens end up registering to vote, and actually only half of a percentage of non-citizens actually vote. So no, they are not voting. The SAVE Act is just another smart way of people to disenfranchise people. Our history says it all. It lays it out. It's not new. Just like they did in New Jersey in 1807 when they took women's right to vote away by saying there's a lot of fraud in voting. That's what they're doing now. Now I have seen, hold on. I have seen our government claim, okay, India has all of their people registered to vote, and they use biometrics to do it, right? And I believe that that is true. I will tell you that when my in-laws have voted, they will come and they will have this dye across their fingernail, and the dye, it does not go away. Once you voted, that your fingernail is dyed, and until it grows out, it's there. So they have that way to confirm everyone votes. Now, what do? We check IDs a lot of times. We have people sign. I know Kansas, you have to have a photo ID. Some places, maybe you don't. But we do verify that people are voting legally. It's very rare that anyone is not voting legally. And since they bring up India, I will share this article with you. But I found it so interesting. I found this article last year, and you will see they have the voter box, and they actually will take it up the mountain to find the voter to let him vote. They forge across rivers to take the voting booth to the voters. And so while we are saying we want to make sure only citizens vote, and look, India does it, okay, well, then let's take the voting booth to the people. Because what have we done instead? Well, if you look at Georgia, Georgia's a really good example. Voting locations started shutting down. And you would have people, I read one article and I'll share it with you when I'm done. A lady went to vote at 3:30 in the afternoon and she had to wait for 5 hours to vote. I will tell you, I have never waited more than 10 minutes to vote in my life, and I have been voting since I was 18 years old. There is a problem when poorer areas, and it is poorer areas that do not have the voting places, have to go and wait in these long lines. They spend, somebody from that same day was there, didn't get to vote until after midnight. These are all the ways that they attempt to keep people from voting. And if we are going to be the greatest democracy in the world, then don't we need to assure that all of the people that can vote have equal ability to do so? Now, how can we do that? Well, they want to implement these rules in the SAVE Act. So here's my proposal. Let's go ahead and do that. Except it's going to be, the onus is going to be on the government to make sure that everyone can prove their citizenship. We will have to have assistance to do that. The onus should be on them to make sure that everyone has the documentation that they need. Well, who's going to pay for that? Okay, so I have a proposal for that too. Let's make it where, people aren't going to like this one. Let's make it where it's a sliding scale. It's income based. So if you can't afford it, if you're below a certain income, you don't have to pay for your voter ID. The more you make, the more you have to pay. Now, people that make more money are not going to like that. Why? Because it's not fair to them. But then it's also not fair to the people that don't have $160 to pay for a passport, or don't have between $10 and $89 to just buy a driver's license, because that is what it costs. That's the range of prices as far as my research has taken me, between $10 and $89 to pay for a driver's license. That's not fair either. It's not fair for the people who have to wait in line for 5 hours or more. It's not fair for people whose voting locations are shut down the day before and they don't know where they have to go to vote, which is what happened in Georgia. So, yeah, maybe it wouldn't be fair to have that sliding scale, and the wealthier you are, the more you pay for your voter registration, and that's how we fund it all. But the opposite is also not fair. So if you're going to do it, at least put the onus on the people that can afford it. That's my 2 cents on that. One other thing I wanted to talk about. So we talked about these, the lies about voter registration and all of that that's out there. Guys, I know people that can build houses, and they are amazing. And I would never try to build a house. If I wanted to build a house, I'll call them. I know preachers who have spent their lives studying religion. And if I have a question about religion, I'm going to call them. I know attorneys who practice in personal injury, and I do not. If I have a question or a concern about personal injury, I'm going to find those experts. I know when my plumbing is messed up, I'm calling the plumber. When I need my house painted, I'm calling the house painter. I'm calling people who have spent their lives dedicated to doing these things. For some reason, over the past few years, we have started disparaging people who have spent their lives, scientists, doctors, historians, lawyers, judges. They are disparaging people that have spent their lives doing this work so that they can put lies out for the people to believe them. And I'm not saying it's one side or the other. I'm saying it's being done. I saw a post today that made me enraged, and then I did research on it, and it turned out that it was wrong. So let's remember, you're an expert at something, okay? You know way more than me about a lot. I know what I know about. I know about law. I know about history. Those are my areas. I know about immigration law. Those are the things that I know about. I promise you, you know a lot more than me about a lot of things. And if I need that advice, I'm going to come to you. So let's be careful when we look for our resources. I've seen a lot of bad information out there. I've seen information that, really puts down our medical field, suggests that there are cures for cancer when there are not. And I know there's not because my husband does cancer research, and his mother, he doesn't like me to talk about it, and he had people very close to him who have suffered from a lot of cancer, and if there was a cure for it, I would know. He would have found it. So it doesn't exist. It's really insulting to people who suffer through it. It's really insulting to the scientists, to the doctors, to all of these people who put everything they have into these services, into learning to better us, for people to say, well, there's a cure for it. They just don't want us to have it. Now, we can argue all day about pharmaceutical companies or whatever like that. They are for profit. No discussion there. They are for profit. That's another day. That's another live stream. But be careful where you're getting your information. I do my best to make sure that I verify everything that I'm sharing with you. If you ever see me not, call me out. I don't want to share bad information. I do not want to be a part of the lies that are being spread or the half-truths that I see being spread out there. So please, call me out. Come argue with the attorney. Come prove the attorney wrong. I'm totally fine with it. I have no problem with it. And then last thing, a lot of you might have watched my speech from Saturday's protest. I saw a lot of videos of, counter protests. There were some people driving around with, Trump flags on their truck out there. And the initial reaction to the counter protests is to yell at them. But I'm going to ask you, if you can, where you can, don't yell at them. If anything, put your sign down until they're gone. As I said in my speech, our enemies want us fighting, and they rejoice in it. And so every time that truck drove by and someone yelled at that truck, well, that's good for our enemies, but not for us. And I understand the anger that's out there right now. I felt it for a long time. And I have only just recently been able to get past it. So I'm not asking you to, forgive and forget. I'm not asking you to come to the table and compromise right now. I'm just saying, hey, somebody's going to have to take the higher road at some point. Or the alternative is something I don't even want to think about. So when and where you can, reach out, try to be nice. When and where you can, or even if you can't be nice, just ignore. And that's it. Any questions? No comments, no questions. I guess next week I'm thinking I might talk about the Insurrection Act, because I'm seeing that go around a lot, and the possibility that this administration might try to implement the Insurrection Act as of April 20th. So that'll give us a few days before there to call. There was something being voted on tomorrow. The No Rogue Judges Act. Call your representatives and your senators. They're supposed to be voting on something called, I just read it, the No Rogue Judges Act. And this is where Congress is trying to limit the authority of the courts. I see this as a very dangerous move. Any attack on our independent judiciary should be seen as a very dangerous move, because it's the attempt is to take power away from one of the three branches that we have that, as I said in my speech, were put there so that we never fall to tyranny. And that's a dangerous precedent to set. So call them, tell them what you think, tell them not to vote no on this rogue judges act or whatever it's called. Anyways, that's it. Thank you all for coming, and if you watch it later, thank you for watching it, and that's it. I'll talk to you later. Y'all have a great week. Bye.